Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Robin Niblett, the director of Chatham House. It would be nice to say it's good to see you again, and so good to see so many people I know in the room, but obviously I can't do that. But I can see we've got a great group of people joining us today for what will be a very interesting and important and well-timed discussion with Raj Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Raj, fantastic that you can join us today. I'm going to introduce Raj properly in a second. I just want to do my usual bit of housekeeping at the beginning of this meeting to remind you all that this meeting is on the record. So we're going to be hearing some remarks from Raj Shah in a minute. We will maybe follow up, or I will, with a couple of questions, and then I definitely want to engage of many of you as possible who are joining us today with questions and comments and thoughts, and make this as interactive as possible. This meeting is being pulled together in coordination with our US Americas program led by Leslie Vinjamuri. Leslie always runs fantastically inclusive and conversational meetings. I hope I can live up to that standard myself today. But I really have appreciated the chance myself to step up and run the conversation with Raj. As I said, we're on the record. When you want to ask your questions, don't wait till the end. Start putting them into the Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll keep an eye on them. And when it comes to the moment, we'll start either asking you to unmute, or I will ask the questions depending on how the flow and the timing of this meeting is running. Obviously, remember, it's on the record. You can tweet away and share what you're hearing today with those beyond this meeting and after it as well. Because as I said at the beginning, I think that the topic we're going to be discussing today is hugely important. Raj Shah has put forward the idea that this is the time for a COVID charter. And there's all sorts of historical coincidences and anniversaries that make this a good time to be discussing it, going right back to the Atlantic Charter between the United Kingdom and the US and the days of FDR and Churchill, when they came up with ideas of how you could rebuild the world after the terrors and horrors of the Second World War. And in essence, Raj Shah is putting forward the idea that this is a moment of equal historic moment and importance. And it requires, therefore, the kind of adjustments to the ways that we structure international relations, but especially international development into the future. And being able to pick up that moment to develop what he's called an entirely new paradigm for global development is going to be the subject of our conversation today. Raj Shah took up his position as the president of the Rockefeller Foundation in 2017. He had served prior to that in the Obama administration, where he'd been the administrator of the US AID, and had also served, I don't know if it was concurrently or briefly, in the Department for Agriculture as the Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics. But those two elements, in a way, capture the history that he's brought at the Gates Foundation, where in particular he really developed some of the most innovative thinking there across the whole range of topics that are now the subject that he spends all of his time on at Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of the world's leading foundations, global foundations, working on the big issues of health for women and children in particular, for nutritious and sustainable food systems. And Rockefeller has a very proud history there of leading the Green Revolution. Third point, ending energy poverty, which, as we know, afflicts so many people in the world. And importantly, the whole concept of meaningful economic mobility, being a US-based foundation, quite an emphasis on the US, but also with the Rockefeller Foundation's charter, looking at global development as a whole. Raj, I don't want to take up too much more of this meeting with all of these introductory words. It's fantastic to have you with us. And I know we'll be able to get into the meat of this now with your opening remarks and the Q&A. But if I could just ask you to kick us off with, I suppose, the big question of what the COVID charter is about. And you've put COVID in the front there, as opposed to a sort of charter for development or so on. So I'm really interested to see how you're connecting the concept of how we recover from, go through, come through this pandemic and the global development agenda that you've been pushing so actively in your career along, and now obviously the Rockefeller Foundation have as well. Over to you, Raj, floor's yours.
Well, thank you, and hello, Robin, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Greetings to everyone who's joining us. I'm honored to be with you and the entire Chatham House team and community for this discussion, as you point out, of the crisis we're in with COVID-19, but really what the world can do to meet this moment. 80 years ago, off the coast of Newfoundland, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met on the decks of the USS Augusta to discuss a world war still in its early days. The United Kingdom had been engaged for more than a year. For the United States, the war was still a few months off, and it wouldn't end for either country for another 5 years. But now that meeting is very well known to many here today. It's part of a relationship that has stood the test of time between the United Kingdom and the United States. Its output, the Atlantic Charter, still embodies many of the values the United States, the UK, and many others cherish and promote and continue. And this partnership was shaped in part by our two historic institutions. Chatham House was deeply involved in the war, of course, before, during, and after, and a critical part of its successful conclusion. And the Rockefeller Foundation helped vaccinate Allied troops and shape the post-war order as well. I bring up the Roosevelt-Churchill meetings today because they're a reminder of how important it is for leaders to see the big picture during a crisis. On the decks of that ship, they were clearly dealing with urgent and critical, but time-sensitive issues, conversations and cables, and they debated those issues with intensity, as you would expect. But Roosevelt and Churchill were also in that moment thinking much bigger, not just about the crisis at hand, but about the opportunity to prevent the next one. And that's, I hope, the connection that leads us to the conversation I hope we can have today. Those two leaders believed, and history has proven them right, that World War I and the Great Depression created deprivations and divisions, that this divergence and the anger it unleashed in their populations was deeply destabilizing and set the stage for World War II. So to ensure a more durable peace, Roosevelt and Churchill sought to build a global order that prevented persistent fear, want, and inequity. That's true leadership, and that's why we remember them so fondly. Today, 18 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, the gravest global crisis since World War II, I hope all of us can look for that same opportunity. If we follow the example set by Roosevelt and Churchill, I'm confident that we can meet the moment we're in, ending this pandemic now, but also preventing the next global crisis. So today, I hope to talk a little bit about what went wrong, how we can make it right, and why I'm confident we can do so together. First, in reality, I want us to remember the world that Roosevelt and Churchill left behind. In the months that followed their meeting in Newfoundland, American and British economic policymakers began post-war planning. Their worry was that persistent fear and want, leaving people to struggle and to starve, created risks for everyone. Such suffering might stoke the anger that could fuel communists, nationalists, and worse. And if left unattended, their greatest fear was that it could become kindling for World War III. To avoid that fate, Allied leaders and economic officials sought not just to rebuild the world, but to build back a better one. And they explicitly set the goal of convergence, in which capital and technology and connectivity would flow more freely and help lower income countries in particular grow fast enough to dramatically improve the living standards of their populations. One result of this thinking was the Bretton Woods institutions, designed to industrialize and connect economies to avoid the inequity that had proved so costly before the war. The World Bank lent resources to sovereign nations to rebuild and then establish the foundations for broader and more inclusive growth. The IMF was designed to put out economic fires before they grew and spread. Another consequence of this way of thinking was America's massive commitment to global development. Through the Marshall Plan, American officials invested more than $13 billion at its peak, at the time 2% of US GDP, to rebuild devastated industries and infrastructure in 16 countries across Europe. Of course, we all know that the results were astonishing. Over almost 80 years, and especially during the last 30 years, billions of people have risen out of poverty, democratic governance largely expanded, and people became freer from fear and from want. Unfortunately, COVID-19 and frankly, the insufficient global health and economic response to it has not only put an end to this convergence trend, it has also started a great divergence that threatens to be persistent for the coming decade. Globally, the response has just been too under-resourced, too market-reliant, and too uncoordinated. The most glaring example has been inequitable access to vaccination. Right now, 61% of those people living in richer countries are immunized and thereby protected from COVID-19. But 96% of poor people living in poorer countries, are still exposed. Although some new commitments have recently been announced, the world is clearly not on track to achieve sufficient herd immunity everywhere. And this is for three basic reasons. First, we've not funded immunization efforts sufficiently. Most analyses, including Rockefeller's own analysis, suggest that you need about $50 billion to achieve 70% on a global basis and in every country. But we have barely raised about a third of that today. Second, we've left the supply side of this problem to private markets. And the result has been exactly what you'd expect: inequitable manufacturing, distribution, and sales. And the third is that there's no global operational initiative with the leadership, accountability, and responsibility for ensuring that we not only deliver vaccines to lower income countries, but achieve shots in arms so that you get to 70% herd immunity. We've also seen a similarly insufficient response to the pandemic's economic crisis. Wealthier nations have spent trillions of dollars, more than 24% of their total GDP, to stimulate growth, vaccinate their citizens, and adapt or transition their economies to ideally a more green recovery. Meanwhile, around the world, we've seen huge inequities in economic response. Countries have been left behind without the resources to address COVID-19 from a fiscal perspective. Emerging and developing economies have been able to respond with economic measures equivalent only to 6% and 1.9% of their GDPs respectively. And no one has managed to fill this gap, or even really tried. Advanced economies committed $161 billion to overseas development in 2020, which was really just a very small boost from the level in 2019, and only 1% of what they spent at home last year in emergency measures. At the same time, the World Bank and other multilateral development banks have increased year-on-year lending by about 40% since 2019, but that's far short of the 76% increase they were able to muster during the global financial crisis of 2008. The result is a world divided between those who can endure the pandemic and those who really remain at its mercy. Without interventions, this economic divergence could last for a decade or more. And to understand why this divergence is so risky for all of us, it is important to consider the economic, political, and social impacts of vast increases in poverty. Of the 500 million people expected to have been driven into poverty, about 100 million live on less than $1.90 per day, the kind of extreme poverty that frankly should be inconceivable in the 21st century. But about 400 million people who live on less than $5.50 per day are wage laborers who are being pushed downward. Before the pandemic, they were making enough to aspire for more, drive local economic growth, create jobs, provide political and social stability in their communities. But now they're falling behind. The world is already witnessing the staggering consequences of this kind of poverty and this pushing downward of the middle class in democracies like India, in developing nations like Haiti, and borders like that of the southern United States. Unless reversed, this divergence will create additional crises in emerging and developing economies and for all of us. More frequent, chaotic, and larger migrations, mass unemployment, increased authoritarian governance and democratic backsliding, failed states, and civil wars. And ultimately, the inability to confront climate change, which will make all of these consequences so much worse, and so much worse in those places that are the lowest income. To end this great and dangerous divergence, we really have to do things differently and use this moment to lead. In fact, we have to follow the leadership of Churchill and Roosevelt and do the extraordinary in responding to this crisis in a way that prevents the next one. To do so, the world needs a new, reinvigorated model of global cooperation and convergence. And as you noted, I recently proposed a 5-point COVID charter that I believe can reimagine what's possible for the future of global development. First, developing economies must mobilize a greater share of their domestic economy as domestic revenue so that they can raise and invest 25% of their GDP in their home countries. Right now, low-income countries raise government revenue of about 14% of GDP, and middle-income countries are nearing 20%. Meeting the COVID Charter's 25% commitment could mobilize trillions of dollars for basic human development, especially if reforms are made to address corruption and other issues. Second, advanced economies can encourage that investment by agreeing to devote at least 1% of their GDP to development. This would increase assistance by about $350 billion. And I know this runs counter to the trend in many countries, including the United Kingdom, which for years has been a model of global development commitment until it cut that commitment to ODA this summer. It's also far less than the 2% of GDP the United States spent on the Marshall Plan at the peak of its execution. This new commitment would basically triple what advanced economies are doing right now for global development and climate efforts. But we must keep that number in context. It would still be only 3% of what those countries spent at home in 2020 to deal with the emergency. Third, in addition to those measures, leaders and shareholders need to seriously reimagine the Bretton Woods institutions and architecture. This week's World Bank and IMF meetings are an important opportunity to do so and to leverage these institutions much more aggressively and much more creatively. Although the IMF issued $650 billion in special drawing rights in August, only 3% or 21 billion of these SDRs have gone to the lowest income countries. Shareholder nations must commit to reallocate their unneeded special drawing rights to support pandemic response in lower and middle income countries. Wealthier nations, including the United States, the UK, Spain, Italy, and China, can and should take immediate steps to recycle at least $100 billion in SDRs, which they don't need at all, and which would help, therefore, allow those other countries to access vaccines and support fiscal stimulus in a manner that more closely approximates what's happened in the industrial world. The resources of the World Bank and other MDBs can also, frankly, be much more aggressively deployed and tailored to meet the moment we're in. At a time of historically low interest rates, these are banks, and they could all raise and lend additional funds. That's what we did at the Rockefeller Foundation. We turned to the bond markets for the first time for charitable purpose, for the first time in more than 100 years, because it made sense to leverage our endowment and because it allowed us to commit to spend $1 billion over a short number of years to address the pandemic, support the recovery, and prevent the next one. Multilateral development banks can effectively do the same by reassessing their capital adequacy requirements, and with the right shareholder support, we estimate could lend an additional $1 trillion during this emergency period. Fourth, we know there are big global challenges where innovation and technology and logistics, mostly from the private sector, are absolutely required to solve the problem. We all need to unlock the potential of public-private partnerships to ensure that critical technologies for humanity, such as vaccines and renewable energy technologies, are accessible to everyone and not just the most fortunate. And fifth and finally, these commitments and their results should be measured by the G7, the G20, and the UN Security Council, or some combination of those institutions, because that level of transparency enables us to identify what's working and what isn't, and because that level of accountability ensures real political support and direct engagement from heads of state. In closing, I want to reiterate why I think now is a moment when we can actually reinvigorate the field of global development. When you look at the picture of Churchill and Roosevelt from the USS Augusta in 1940, what strikes you is how young they both looked. Churchill had some of his boyish defiance. Roosevelt still had a jauntiness to his jawline and demeanor. Years later, at Yalta and Casablanca, those youthful echoes had faded. The war, the fear, the responsibility of it all had taken a significant toll. The horrors of World War II, of losing loved ones, of losing resources, of losing not just some of the bloodiest battles in history, but also losing entire belief systems, inspired Churchill and Roosevelt to take bold action. The fear that they had in that moment of crisis gave them the confidence and the courage to ensure that they put in place solutions so that this would never happen again. In many ways, we have that same experience today. Each of us knows the feeling of loss and suffering individually and in our countries, from the surges in the United Kingdom to the smoke rising off funeral pyres in India, to the current wave of death and loss being experienced in the United States. Those memories are a reminder of just how much is riding on getting this right. And we know that we're so much better than what we've been through. We know how to ensure that we create a world defined by convergence and not divergence. We know how to cooperate across public and private to solve the challenges that face us. And if we can use this moment of crisis to get our own set of courage and a willingness to be bold, we can put the resources into the future to ensure that this, in fact, never happens again. So thank you, Robin, for having me here, and thank you to Chatham House for all the great work you do. And I look forward to having a discussion with the community that's joined us today.
Thank you very much indeed, Raj. Very important points, and actually drawing those historical parallels, that need to plan at the moment of crisis, not when the moment of crisis is fully over, is very well taken. Good to see that photo of our Neil Malcolm room downstairs in your little collection there. A lot of men in military uniform smoking, but nonetheless, it was a moment where the Institute came together.
Well, I hope I get a tour when I can come visit.
You certainly will. And we got some nice quotes actually from some of the people you mentioned there up on the walls these days. So, and the traffic might be better than you experience in New York, but only by a little bit. Look, I want to turn, if I can, and let me just remind everyone here, those who've joined since Raj started his remarks, this meeting is on the record. We have a good half an hour. We might tip over by 5 minutes or so at the end to engage in some Q&A. Please, preferably, use the Q&A function to submit your questions. I can either ask them to myself, or I might be able to get you unmuted so you can ask them yourselves as well. So don't be shy. But if you are shy, I've got like 10 questions here, and I will certainly pile my way through them. But Raj, can I just take you right to the core question, especially one that your photos at the beginning and the end brought absolutely to the fore. There were two giant individuals leading one already actually emerged superpower, the United States, but certainly standing the most powerful nation in the world at that moment. The UK, the fading empire, but nonetheless still had an empire, and at the end of the war on the winning side. And in a way, they had a credibility, an authority to speak and to imagine the ways you've described. So you know where I'm going with this question. Who can the US play that leadership role today? The fact that it's not that I don't think the UK, has a role to play, but right now the UK is trying to work out its relationship with Europe and where it goes global and all of that stuff. So it's hard for it to play the kind of leadership role globally that it did before, across the whole gamut, the way that the Atlantic Charter envisaged. It has been renewed, as you know, in the most recent visit by President Biden to the UK. There's a new Atlantic Charter, which we can talk about later. But the United States in particular, is facing huge challenges at home. And do you think the US, let me ask you that question, is the US ready to play that leadership role today? And does it have to for your charter to work?
Well, yes, I think US leadership is absolutely critical. I've, served with and for President Obama and Vice President Biden. And I've seen the faith that Vice President Biden has in US leadership. And so I believe as president, he is reinvigorating the US leadership role. That said, I do think this requires a more multipolar approach given the reality of the global economy today. And this reinvigorating the fight for development and climate, which really are the same fight and should be fully integrated, is a responsibility of the United States, of the UK, of the EU, of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And the G20 is a optimal vehicle really for bringing on the types of reforms that I'm talking about. So, the Italian leadership of the G20 has set the stage for it. I'd like to see, more concrete outcomes along the lines of what we've discussed here in this year's G20. I also think the Indonesian G20 next year is a real moment of opportunity, led by leaders who participated in shaping and creating the Sustainable Development Goals and who see firsthand the crisis of climate that is upon us. And so I think the G20 is probably the optimal vehicle for putting the intellectual and political underpinnings of a COVID charter in place. But that's not going to happen without strong support and leadership from the United States and from the UK. And I'd say one thing further, because we're of course in a UK setting here. I hope that the UK will reemerge as a global development leader. The UK commitment to 0.7, maintenance of that commitment through difficult fiscal environments and difficult politics was a clarion call to the rest of the world. And I hope that can be reintroduced as a core component of how the UK sees its foreign policy and national security priorities going forward. And I think that's part of the solution.
No, thanks on that. And I very much echo your last comment there. I'm on the record, along with many other people, in not only making that hope, but noting that the fact that UK GDP had dropped means there would have been a drop in any case. That's the whole point of GDP targets, is they can move with GDP as it rises or falls without having to take additional action. But it does capture, maybe this is my second question, and we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to folks on the call in a second, but it does bring me to the other sort of big meta question. And the reason the British government in the end made that cut is that, as you yourself noted, huge amounts of national governments, including the UK's wealth, have been thrown at trying to smooth out the impacts of the crisis on ordinary workers, principally, and making sure the jobs could be protected, try to learn the lessons of the global financial crisis and the austerity measures that followed, not to lose the political support of their people. One of the big things you mentioned out of the Atlantic Charter. And I mean, do you, A, I suppose, have some sympathy with that? And B, how do you think this particular moment of huge financial pressure on the key movers that we need here, whether it be the Italian government for that matter with their debt, or now the British government or the American government. I mean, how politically feasible, let me just be blunt, do you think it is to go to 1% when so many people aren't even at 0.7? What's your sort of motivation politically almost? I mean, you're astute on this to make that call.
Yeah, I think there are two or three things on that. The first is, in reality, if you're sitting in a country that has a relatively high immunization rate and a strong economic rebound, the greatest economic risk you face is another variant of COVID-19. Delta, of course, came from India. We know that the next variants will come from places that are where viral replication is highest. Rockefeller experts have estimated that it's sort of 6 times more likely that a new variant of international concern will emerge from a lesser developed country with lower immunization rates than from an industrial country. For buying off the risk of that alone, it would be well worth it to make this relatively modest investment in sustaining a recovery that, as you just pointed out, has cost trillions and trillions of dollars, right? So that's the first and perhaps foremost rationale, which is not a global development rationale. It's not a national security rationale. It really is about protecting the recovery that is taking hold in certain places and knowing how precarious that would be. Remember, by 1918 standards, we're still in the middle of what was a 5-6 year path in terms of a global pandemic that has achieved this much viral replication. I'd say second, I do think there's a need to bring the climate and the development communities together. The world is coming to Glasgow in just a few weeks, and it's been abundantly clear that developing countries, middle-income economies, are not joining the global effort to agree to emissions cuts as aggressively as others, for good reason. They point out that they still have the task of lifting the living standards of much of their populations, and the rest of the world did it by burning fossil fuels, and they should have multiple development paths available to them. We've said for at least 10 years, at least since Paris, but probably since Copenhagen, that wealthier nations would simply provide resources and technology to solve that problem, to make sure that the development path for developing countries can be green and can also be uplifting of their people. And yet we've never fulfilled that $100 billion a year commitment. So part of this increase is simply an honest reflection of we never met our Copenhagen and Paris commitments, and we need to build that in a way that doesn't trade off against the reality here. So for those reasons, I think there is, and frankly, I just think the way people think about the role of the state during a crisis is different than you would from a fiscal management perspective than you would in a different setting. So I do think it's politically feasible, but we need a movement to get everybody there. And I hope your colleagues on this call can be part of that movement.
No, thank you, Raj. We'd certainly believe in the push and want to be behind it and are behind it. To that point, actually, on the first point you raised there about the risks of the pandemic itself, variants, etc. Can I bring in 2 questions? Because I think I've got 2 questions waiting here. One from my colleague, Rob Yates, who leads actually our Center for Global Health and for Universal Health as well. And we've got Raju Smg as well, both have got questions actually on the question of focusing on vaccines and where this fits into your plan. So maybe, Rob, why don't you go first? I think your question is broader, and then I'll bring Raju second. Let's see if I've got you both open there. Yeah, Rob, why don't you go first, and then I'll turn to Raju.
Super, thank you very much indeed, Robin, and greetings, Raj. A super presentation, thank you very much. I think sort of looking at the future, I think the idea of a COVID charter is a super idea, and everyone's looking for ideas of how we build back better. But don't you think that really our focus should be on nailing this issue around vaccine equity at the moment, because it is just so bad, particularly the performance of G7 countries in not sharing vaccines and technology, that one feels that any sort of negotiations around long-term charters and treaties and things like this are going to really lack credibility whilst we've got this dreadful situation. So do you think we should nail the vaccine equity first before moving on to the charter discussions? Thank you.
Just hold your thought on that, Raju. Let me bring Raju Singh as well in, Raj, if I can, and then you can sort of work your way through both those. Raju, please, could you unmute and ask your question as well?
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Raju, for a wonderful presentation and also a good initiation on COVID Charter. My question is basically on the innovation in the COVID vaccines. As you know, we have produced the fastest COVID vaccine in a record time, and also lots of countries are vaccinating. But the challenge is about equitable access to the vaccines, especially for the low and middle income countries. As you know, there has been a lot of resistance for sharing of the technology with some of the patented medicines. So any thoughts on how the new COVID Charter will help to tide the challenges in the area of, for example, TRIPS waiver at the WTO, and also the technology transfer, so that the world can vaccinate faster? So I understand 25% investment from the developing country is a good initiative, but still, even though they have the money, but they cannot buy the vaccines in the global market. Thank you.
Over to you on those two questions, Raj.
Sure, happy to address both. And first, thank you, Robert, for your comment. I agree. Look, I think at the end of the day, either we see ourselves as interconnected and we use this moment to both ensure 70% coverage everywhere, which is the goal that now leaders have agreed to, but their resources and the supply side and the demand side support has not been put in place to achieve it. And we have to see that as part of an effort to respond to COVID-19. I mean, COVID, as we see in industrial countries, is primarily a health crisis, but often the most expensive components of it from a social perspective have been the economic devastation that it's wrought. And so I think you have to just do both together. And I don't actually think it's possible to, for example, solve the supply side of the vaccine problem and not provide the fiscal space and resources in countries to meet a broad range of social sector needs, including the distribution and health access issues that are the difference between kind of getting vaccines to airports and getting vaccines into arms. So to me, a lot of this kind of comes together. And I think a COVID charter, an embrace of a COVID charter, can be the vehicle to help generate the $50 billion, can be the vehicle to help generate a different kind of structure and operational arrangement around achieving the 70%, and can be the vehicle for unlocking the long-term fiscal support necessary to achieve these broader goals over time. But you're right. Step one is getting 70% vaccination everywhere and tackling that problem with $50 billion of real commitment. I think the second point is also important, Raju. And Rockefeller and our team, we're supportive of the TRIPS waiver. We're supportive of building capacity around the world. But I also don't think of that as the urgent and immediate solution to the problem. The urgent and immediate solution is more vaccine donations from countries that are hoarding vaccine doses. And I think the UK is fairly high on that list, along with Germany, and potentially, while the US has been the biggest donor of vaccines, we also carry some excess and run the risk of having some expiring doses in those three countries, but also in other places. And those should be donated immediately. But I think the second component of it is putting in place a different kind of arrangement with the existing manufacturers. So I'll give you one example. Moderna has, and there was a good New York Times piece on this that finally made public what many who have been working on this know. Moderna has a more attractive vaccine from cold chain management perspective than, say, Pfizer for some lower resource settings. Yet they haven't been willing to sell the vaccine at volume to the United States as part of the donation program. And they've made access quite difficult. Now, they are, in fact, building out and have committed to build out local capacity, I guess, for manufacturing in Africa. But that feels like something that's going to help for the next crisis, not this one. And I worry a little bit that the discussion around the TRIPS waiver and the development of a local and distributed vaccine manufacturing base, which we absolutely need, becomes a little bit of a distraction from the urgent issue of donations, tiered pricing, and volume production, including from Serum Institute of India for the rest of the world. And we just have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Thanks very much for those points. Got a couple of interesting questions about the UN role in this, because there's a phrase that's strangely enough, I mean, you talked obviously about the Bretton Woods institutions, but let's see if my colleagues can open up. Let's see, we've got two people who wanted to ask the UN question. We've got Peter Flewwelling and Fabio Marazzi. And why don't, I don't know, which one of those we could unmute first? Peter, let's see, yeah, Peter, you're unmuted. Why don't you come in? Could you bring your question in about the UN on your behalf and Fabio's behalf? Or maybe you can both ask a question. If Peter doesn't cover your question well enough, Fabio, I'll bring Peter in. I'll bring Fabio in after you, Peter. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really enjoying this this discussion. I'm sitting here in Tokyo, working for an IGO, North Pacific Fisheries Commission. But my question is that the UN has tremendous organizations and outreach. First, what is their role in this? And have they adopted the COVID Charter? And number two is, if not, how can we encourage them to take this on and use the resources that they've got to ensure a greater distribution of the vaccines without it becoming involved in local corruption, which often happens in these pandemics? And then second, if they're not involved in it, then should they be, and what measures can the United States use to push them? Measures the banks and the foundations use to push them to take on this responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Fabio, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question, or is that covered? Fabio, you can unmute if you want. Fabio's not unmuting, so he's had his moment. Why don't you go ahead and take the question then, please, on behalf of both Fabio and Peter, about kind of where you see the UN as an institution sitting in this.
Sure. Well, thank you, Peter. And my first response is I think the UN is absolutely critical to this response. But I'll point out that, you know, we have at times when needed, take, for example, with the fight against HIV/AIDS, created new institutions to help optimize the emergency response. You know, in that case, both the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria and UNAIDS, the UN AIDS operational agency, were created together to help, to help drive the response during a crisis. And I think we'd have to look at and should look at the UN institutions and get a better sense for which institutions should carry the mandate most aggressively for COVID-19 vaccination, for example, and how to ensure there's real operational accountability on the ground. And specifically, one of the challenges, I think, is that UNICEF, which is the world's childhood immunization arm, effectively, is focused on children, right? And WHO is focused usually on normative policymaking and technical issues, and has been traditionally far less operational on the ground. And so when you ask yourself who has the operational capacity to achieve 70% in 70 lower income countries, the answer is not immediately clear. And that's the kind of accountability that I'd be calling for within something like a renewed COVID charter.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm piling along here because we've got lots of good questions coming in. I want to get them all. There's a couple of questions that are focused, as I think you did very importantly in your 5 points. I think it was really in the second point, at least certainly in your Foreign Affairs article. And I think it was the first point in your speech today, at least if I got the two, which is the kind of responsibilities of the recipient countries. And I wanted to bring in Miriam Mutiswa, and we also have Pia Irwin, I think, on this as well. I'd like to bring Chatham House team, if you can find Pia, I'll get both of them to ask their question. Miriam, why don't you go first, and then I'll bring Pia in after that. Pia, if you could hold for a second. Miriam, I think, is up first. Miriam, if you can unmute. Let's see. If Miriam can't unmute, then I will ask a question, but we'll get Pia, I know, can unmute. So Pia, why don't you go first?
Hi, thank you for the basis of the charter, which I found very interesting. I was very much focusing on the IMF and World Bank, and obviously in their financing always comes with controls and responses from the recipient countries, but also which is fine, but sometimes makes some of the financing unattractive to recipient countries. How would the Charter deal with that? And how would the Charter deal with the recipient countries and their spend, and make sure that the spend is appropriately distributed or implemented within the economies to achieve what is required? I think those were sort of the main points that I was interested in, how the Charter would tackle those areas.
Thank you, Pia. Yeah, critical question, Raj, over to you. And I know that was the same concept Miriam wanted to bring in as well. So could you take that question from the two of them?
Yeah, well, thank you both, and Pia, and it also dovetails with something Peter had said about corruption. I think first, the whole issue of efficiency of spending and accomplishment and results achieved through that spend efficiency is a movement that, in my view, sort of really gained steam around 2000 and has become more and more significant in the governance of overall development spending, and needs to continue. And that means being more serious about the fight against corruption, being more focused on measuring and evaluating results, and frankly, having reporting mechanisms that matter. I think one of the gaps in what we tried to address with the Charter is current reporting mechanisms are sort of internal to agencies and are not globally transparent and not as politically relevant. So I'd like to ensure that, say, the UN Security Council evaluate the performance of partners, institutions, and countries in the context of the COVID Charter, and elevate the idea of results and accountability and transparency to that level of political visibility, which I'd argue doesn't exist today. It exists within sort of the bowels of the World Bank, but that's not enough to generate genuine, sustained political accountability and support. So that on that piece, I'd say that. There were a couple of comments that spoke to, like, how would how would countries achieve the 25%, and what's the component of national pathway to achieve that? And I think that dovetails, Pia, with the first part of your question. And I would just say, countries do come in, from a variety of different places in terms of domestic resources raised and spent as a percentage of their economies. But we know that every nation that sort of goes from lesser developed to middle income to higher income has a fairly similar path of increasing the share of its public spending by mostly raising domestic revenue. And we know that during this crisis in 2020, wealthier nations were often at or above 50% in terms of share economy, in terms of their ability to respond, and lesser developed countries were down around 14%. And that's just inadequate. I mean, Jeff Sachs has done some amazing analysis to show that without another 14%, you have basically no chance of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we need to be on a path to get that up. And I know that, and to me, that sort of mutual accountability has to be part of a true COVID Charter if we're going to be successful.
Fantastic. Can I just do one follow-up question? We're going to try and squeeze a few more in before the time. But when I read your foreign affairs piece on this, Raj, I got a sense that maybe there was an element of conditionality, or the concept at least of conditionality. If this increase in spending, and it would be a big increase, were to be taken up towards 1% of GDP, there would be an expectation that there'd be elements of transparency and so on. And obviously, if you want to go for private-public partnerships and leverage the money, they will expect that kind of greater transparency, and if you want to call it conditionality. Could you just say a bit about the relationship between donor and recipient in this, and what have you learned from your own experience of how to improve that that
Well,
outcome?
you know what I've learned from my own experience is that the donor recipient framework can be a little bit dangerous. Like the reality is, you know, countries are nation states. They have primary accountabilities to their citizens and stakeholders, and they have the responsibility, and they do raise and spend resources. And, you know, getting that, and if you look across the last decade, all of the growth effectively in what we think of as human development spending comes effectively from domestic resource mobilization. And so countries like Pakistan that a few years ago were at 9% of their economy in terms of domestic resource mobilization make very little progress against SDGs. And countries, you know, like Ghana that were steadily inching up their domestic spend and domestic revenue were making much faster progress against SDGs. That same mind. So I'm not saying that this is conditional. What I'm saying is we have to recognize that that's first and foremost what counts against driving success in terms of achieving convergence instead of divergence. And we have to then partner with nations that are willing to do the hard work of improving the efficiency of spend, of difficult work of raising domestic revenue in a transparent way and committing it to human development objectives. Those nations should receive greater support. And part of that greater support, and I think someone asked this question, I didn't answer it directly, is having better and more efficient and more novel instruments out of the multilateral development infrastructure. You know, it can't just be the same IBRD, IDA tools that we've offered for decades. It has to be something that's more nimble, more specific. If you look at World Bank commitments on global health spending, and for COVID-19, they've committed $12 billion to the global health effort. And most of those resources have gone, you know, non-drawn down. And they're not drawn down because they're, you know, in the traditional instruments and they're difficult to access nation by nation. They don't move very quickly. And so, you know, we just have to be more creative at creating structures that meet the moment, as opposed to using structures that we know how to implement and have been doing so for decades.
Perfect. I've got a few more questions I want to bring in, keeping an eye on time, Raj. But Emil, why don't you come in? A very practical question, which I think I'm worried we'll miss out at the end if we don't get it in now. Emil Kirjas, could you ask your question, please? Let's see, Emil, are you able to unmute? If not, I will ask your question for you. It's at the top of the list. There you are.
Yes,
we got you. Go ahead, Emil.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was just wondering if this charter has been presented to a number of world leaders. As I can imagine, they're very curious about the proposal. And what was their take on it, especially of the developed nations like the US, UK, EU, and Japan? Thank you.
Well, I can give you a flavor from some of my personal conversations with leaders in OECD countries related to it. I think there's a great appetite for following US leadership, frankly. So, you know, I look at some countries and they're pretty explicit about a willingness and desire to follow US leadership if the US can get there. In the US, I think there's an appreciation that this kind of a framework is a political rationale for rethinking how we're investing in global development right now. And, you know, it is to be determined whether it actually can have the political support necessary to really enable the kind of US leadership that I think will inspire others to join and take it up. I think there's some bright signs on that front. The United States got behind strongly the $650 billion special drawing rights allocation and has, I believe, publicly committed, or at least publicly indicated, that wealthier nations should reallocate or recycle some of those special drawing rights as a source of effectively emergency finance to support vaccination and recovery. That's a change in the US position from the prior administration to the Biden administration. And it's an example of, I think, the US being willing to lead on novel, innovative efforts that recognize that this special moment calls for special coordinated global action. It's not enough. as I point out, but I think it gives me hope that there's a political opportunity here.
Yeah, no need for you to reply to this, Raj, but just reading some of the questions and comments coming in, including from the head of our global economy and finance team, who was asking a kind of similar question to Emil, and how do you get the political will in there? I mean, he did notice that there are some big things going on, such as the global tax deal, and we've seen places where the US has been able to engage with others and do leadership. Creon's question is, the COVID charter, however, may be so big that it may actually be beyond what can be carried on that burden right now. But maybe I'll let you do a sort of wrap-up comment at the end to address that. I want to bring Joan Kaufman in, because Joan's gone on a kind of goddamn it kind of comment question in the question line. So Joan, I think it's a really good one, and would you mind sharing that with us, Joan, if you could unmute? Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep,
yeah.
We can hear you.
Very good. Well, so my question is, well, I agree with you completely that we can't wait for the TRIPS provision to be enforced, for the current pandemic's vaccination supply to reach countries with low vaccine rates. Why haven't we put more pressure on private companies like Pfizer and Moderna to slash prices and make their vaccines more widely available to the world at low or no cost? Because many of those vaccines, were developed with public funds, like through Operation Warp Speed, and we're still seem to be protecting IP, or intellectual property rights over, and the patents over the global access at this point in the global crisis, when we obviously need to vaccinate the world in order to avoid, continuing variant emerging and things like that. So I just would like to hear your views on that, because I really think I find it shocking that we're still protecting IP at this point in this global crisis.
Well, Joan, I appreciate that. I think at the end of the day, remember that most countries have been dependent on access to vaccines from these very same companies. So, I think there was a period where the focus was, am I going to get my allocation in a timely way at the prices I want to pay if I'm an industrial country? And then only after that was sort of satisfied has there been a serious sort of discussion and any real pressure put on companies to both manufacture for and supply lesser developed nations. I think two other complicating factors have been important here. The first is the Indian government taking the Serum Institute supply off the global market basically dramatically reduced the ability of the international community to achieve even the modest targets that were set for the end of this calendar year, which was very dependent on the AstraZeneca product. And frankly, that product, as we know, is less effective against the Delta variant. And there have been some real supply challenges amongst those companies in the United States. I mean, look at Merck is still not effectively online with extra supply to bolster the manufacturing of the J&J product, et cetera. So I think now you're starting to see that pressure, but I agree with you. It needs to be sort of front and center. I think companies need to be held visibly to account in the public domain if they're participating or not participating in global efforts to make supply available. And that has to be something, that peer pressure has to be something that's brought on those companies so they some of them change this, the perspective they've taken here. I think another part of it is we just haven't had the financing to solve this problem at scale. And when there's erratic and uncoordinated financing, as we've seen in the vaccine space for 22, 23 years, you just don't get the supply side of the industry to respond. That's why Gavi was created. That's why the vaccine fund was created. And that's why instruments like the International Finance Facility for Immunization had such a big impact on the supply side of the market for childhood vaccines. We haven't seen any kind of instrumentation like that on COVID-19 vaccines, and I think that's been a big gap.
We are definitely coming towards the end here. I think partly because of where we are in Europe, here in London, I wanted to get a question in from Gisela, who has a very good, Gisela, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, a very good question about coordination. And I've got I don't know if Leslie wants to come in with a question after Gisela, and I've got a closing one, and then you could wrap it up, Raj. let's see if we can get 2 or 3 on the table for you. And then anything you feel you've missed out and you want to share with us, please do. Gisela, to you first.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I hope you can hear me.
Okay, we can hear you well.
Excellent. And thank you for a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, I joined late, but I hope I'll be able to get some notes or something at the beginning of the call, because I think this is a really interesting initiative. So I'm based in Geneva, working with Concern Worldwide, which is an NGO focused on hunger and conflict specifically, but we are also, of course, looking very closely at the impacts of COVID. And here in Geneva, you may be well aware that the European Union has proposed the development of an international treaty under the auspices of the World Health Organization on pandemic preparedness, and they have, I think, secured the support of the Director General of the WHO on this. And so I just wondered how this proposed COVID Charter might fit in and intersect and be coordinated with the development of such a treaty if it does go ahead. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So a very specific question there, and I think, Leslie, I can see you've unmuted. Did you have a quick question you wanted to make?
Yeah, I'll just be very quick because I know you need to finish. First of all, thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you speak with all of us at Chatham House. I really appreciated your article, and especially your focus on public-private partnerships, which are so vital, I think. And for those of us in London, we're a stone's throw away from the City of London. And corporates, the financial community are absolutely vital to our discussions on a daily basis, not only as givers, but as creating the solutions, helping us brainstorm. But I'm curious whether in your conversations with people and organizations across what we refer to as the private sector, whether you see a very great difference along national lines. When it comes to the private sector interest and willingness not only to give and be part of these partnerships, but also to help formulate answers to the big global problems, and how you think that may or may not be a barrier. I think about it because I hear some people saying, forget about public-private partnerships, just sort out national tax structures, which seems to me that it's a very particular way of thinking about the role of the private sector, which is perhaps different from what we're used to.
And Raj, a last thing for me, you can manage your time effectively and swat your staff away if you need to. B3W, we haven't said that wonderful acronym yet. I'm just wondering, whether that is a big enough initiative that has kind of captured the global imagination. It's a little bit not global, it's a bit more the like-minded countries. But would that fit within the COVID Charter? Would that be part of it? Is it parallel to it? Where does B3W fit into your big architecture? And over to you to manage these last 3 questions any way you want.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Robin. And maybe I'll start, Joan, with your question. But I do think the treaty that Gisela, the treaty that was mentioned is a good example of the types of renewed ideas and agreements around global cooperation that I think are necessary right now. If you think about the parallel back to the moment after World War II, when institutions were reimagined and shared responsibilities were sort of reallocated, it was done in the spirit of creating new agreements, creating new institutions that could persist, capitalizing them appropriately. And so I would like to see more of those types of arrangements, along with the new capital required to achieve the goals, come into place coming out of COVID-19, so that we don't have to go through this kind of crisis again. And that, I think, is a good example of it. On Leslie's question about the tax, the construct of public-private. First, I just want to say I find very appealing the idea that everybody should pay their fair share of taxes, and I think things like the global minimum corporate tax and the renewed transparency that is being brought to tax havens and sheltering of illicit wealth are necessary in so many ways that I can understand why people say just everyone pay your taxes and don't worry about public-private partnership. And I am skeptical, by the way, of kind of announcements that happen kind of years in the future that sometimes appear like they're intended to take pressure off of kind of doing things now. Such as the one I referenced with Moderna. That said, at the end of the day, pandemic response requires a set of technologies that are manufactured by the private sector, and that innovation and production and distribution are all made more efficient and more equitable through public-private partnership. I'd argue the same is true for renewable electrification and renewable energy storage. The same is true for rethinking food and food systems if we're going to do that in an equitable way that addresses the climate. And you really cannot imagine a public sector only, no matter how well resourced, approach that really makes those technologies more equitable. In fact, the Marshall Plan, going back to the Atlantic Charter, was actually a big public-private partnership, circa 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. But it was an investment collaboration and partnerships around construction and technology. And so I do think there's always space for public-private collaboration, and it just has to be done in a way that's true and accountable and where there are real resource consequences on both sides. And I think that is in addition to the basic idea that everyone should pay their fair taxes and we should go after kind of illicit pockets of wealth. And finally, I'd say, and maybe Robin, this is what we could close on. I think your basic point, I assume you're referring to Build Back Better World as a sort of concept that a number of nations, including the United States, have put out there. I think that's a great concept. It's not right now resourced or tied to a set of specific actions that can actually bring back a better world. And frankly, if we're being honest about the analysis, the IMF analysis, World Bank analysis, every time you open the paper, you can read about what is actually happening, which is not Build Back Better World. What's happening is the Great Divergence, where for the first time in 80 years, we're looking at a decade of lower income countries that don't have access to vaccines, that don't have investment to support their economic recovery, diverging, growing more slowly than the wealthier countries. And when there are economic estimates that are getting revised, it's only making the divergence even more stark and even more long-term. So yes, I love the slogan. And I think the COVID Charter and the kinds of ideas we're putting forth that I hope all of you that have participated today will take forward in your own work is the scale of what's required to turn a divergence into convergence and sustain that for decades. And if we do not do that, we do not get a global climate agreement. We do not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals on any kind of delay. And we don't do the basic things we need to prevent the next global crisis. And that is, that I think is an urgent concept. And so whenever we hear phrases that make us feel like folks are looking out for the right destination, we should then ask ourselves, well, what are the actions underneath that language that get us there? This is one proposal of a set of 5 concrete actions that can be taken in a shared and mutual accountability manner that can move us towards convergence and away from, a more painful vision of the future. And I hope this conversation and the great intellect and experience of the people you've assembled for it will help move the ball forward a little bit. So thank you very much for having me and for your time and for your great leadership at Chatham House. And thank you, Leslie, for all the great work you and your team do as well.
Raj, thank you so much. And thanks for taking the time. We've gone quite a bit over time, even we're starting a couple of minutes late. We've certainly got the most out of this discussion. Some great questions from those who signed up onto the Zoom call. I should add there are several hundred, maybe even a bigger number than that. I don't have access to myself on your Rockefeller channel as well, who've been drawing in on this conversation. We look forward on behalf of all my colleagues at Chatham House, Leslie and others to work with you and your colleagues on this very important topic. As you said, trying to make things real and not just the slogans is the critical next step. And as my colleague Rob also said, there is an element of urgency to this, Raj, which we really felt, especially in your closing remarks. So thank you very much for taking the time with us. Thanks everyone for joining us. Some great questions. And we look forward to meeting up before it's too long. All the best. Bye-bye.